the next person, Namita Wiggers, who I love the name of the basketball team here, the Portland Trailblazers, and if I could think of a person that embodies that, it would be Namita, and the fact that she's blazing trails for our community and our culture and our field. Namita is a director and co-founder of Critical Craft Forum, and if you don't know what that is, you really need to look that up immediately and participate in that. She teaches at an MFA in Applied Craft and Design and History of Craft at Portland State University, and will be teaching a curating intensive on curating through craft this summer at the Oregon College of Arts and Crafts. If you can please join me in welcoming Namita Wiggers to the stage.
Thank you. Roberto, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Appreciate it. So good morning. We are here to tell you stories about the ground beneath our feet. The way we're going to move through this is by walking you through both history and time. We will move you through thousands of years, and at moments, both public and individual, sometimes slowly, and at other times at a rapid-fire pace. So this opportunity that NCECA gave me to think about the history of clay in Portland revealed that a single history will not make sense when someone chooses to write this down. What follows in this presentation is a sampling of some of the stories that can be told, a few of the ways in which this can happen, and most of all, brings to my mind the stories that we didn't have time to include today. We're going to begin with my friend and colleague, the sculptor and installation artist, Bill Will, and he will start us off today with geological time, making visible what lies beneath the surface.
I'm going to talk about a public art project that I began about 25 years ago. So I have to look at some notes because I've forgotten a lot of the details, and there are a lot of details. So I'm going to do my own sort of introduction. In 1992, I was chosen to be a member of the design team for the creation of the West Side Light Rail project. This design team included architects, engineers, planners, and artists. This was TriMet's second light rail project and the first to include artwork and artists in the input of the design of the entire line. I worked on this project for 6 years, from the conceptual design phase through the oversight of construction. Ultimately, the project was awarded a Presidential Design Award and was named by USA Today as one of the 10 most important architectural projects of the 20th century. I think we were number 3 on the list. On this project, the artists were not just token advisors in matters of things like, art matters like color or patina. We were equals at the table with all contributors. We literally had our fingers in every aspect of the design, from conceptual design framework to actually colors and patinas. It was the artist members who stimulated the complete redesign of Washington Park Station, which became the jewel of the project and perhaps all of Portland's light rail. This station is located in the West Hills and serves the zoo, the Forestry Center, the Children's Museum, the Arboretum, and the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And it's located in a tunnel that runs through the West Hills. The station platform is 260 feet below the surface, making it the deepest transit platform in North America. At our very first design charrette, we learned about the engineering feat required to build this tunnel in the station platform. It was at this meeting I learned that in order to anticipate the difficulties in digging out a 3-mile-long tunnel, geologists would drill down to the proposed station depth and take out cores or boring samples that they could use then to determine the strata through which they needed to drill. I asked if we could see one of these core samples, expecting someone to arrange to bring one to our next meeting. Instead, a field trip was arranged, and we were taken to a large storage facility where these samples were stored. To my surprise, this very large room contained wooden boxes stacked 10 or so high. Each box contained a segment of each of 87 200 to 300 foot long core samples. Inside each specially constructed box with fitted lid were dividers that separated, protected, and labeled each segment. What I saw in these boxes changed the course of my life for the next 6 years. I'm going to show you some images then, and these are what they look like. Here's a piece of one here. They're about 2.5 inches in diameter, and they represent these different materials. There are about 10 represented here, but these are not singular events. Each one of these might be a multiple flow of lava, and the space between them would be what blew in, silt and so on, that created the soil over hundreds of thousands of years on which things grew and life lived. One of my first questions was, well, how old are these pieces of rock? And the answer was that at the bottom of the core sample, the rock was about 16 million years old. And at the top, it was about 50 years old, where they had sort of scraped and sculpted the top of that area to create parking or whatever, maybe 50 years ago. I had the idea right away that perhaps I could create a timeline by correlating the rock to our calendar and then show what happened during that time period by placing this core sample, in this case, in this long tube. It's a glass tube and it sits in a stainless steel recess. Information about the core sample and the places in time are written above and below it. So here is sort of the beginning of the timeline. Now, I left out those kinds of things that you see in cross sections of trees, like, you know, Columbus. Figured we all know. But I thought things like chewing gum, ketchup, those were interesting, and sort of made sense of this very small portion of this timeline. At the middle, and there's two sides of this, each are 140 feet long, so it's a 280-foot timeline altogether. There's a description above of this project, and below it is this timeline inside of the timeline of our solar system. And you can see it's a very small sliver. My sort of beginning concept was to sort of show how unimportant we are, maybe, in the long term, and to not take ourselves perhaps too seriously. At the end of 140 feet of core sample and rock and dirt and so on it advises you to go to the other side of the platform and walk around the inside of this area. And this is the other side, and you can see that these walls are full of a lot of information. And there's plenty to read. You can come back and spend hours here. This person, however, is looking at their feet. But it's a good image. How I organized this, after finding out what stone represented what place and time, and remarkably, it was relatively well known what the age of these different deposits were. So I could be pretty specific, but you can see here, or in this detail, below the rock is some geological information. It's the depth of the core sample below the surface of that area. And then there's the break between these two different flows of the same lava material. What's really interesting here, what's most beautiful perhaps is the rock, but what's most interesting is the space between it, which is the dirt and mud and clay. There's a lot of clay here. And this is where there was life. And then the next lava flow would come along and completely erase life in this area, in Portland. And that happened over and over again. And this space between these two flows could be 200,000 or 300,000 years, that little bit of dirt, because it blew in as dust. And it took that long to build up and things to grow on it and decay. Above the timeline is all the information, or selected information, that describes what happened on top of the rock, on the planet, with humans, with plant life, and so on. And there's a lot of images and diagrams of things that I just like, things that I've collected these kinds of things. And you are probably all familiar with this, but many people aren't. So I think that it's interesting for them to sort of try to make sense of these things. There's some pieces of the digits for pi, and there's Pascal's triangle, mathematical things. There's the skeleton of Lucy. All these kinds of things that are part of the evolution of life on the planet. And here's another example of that, that, is the best information we had at the time. And this is at the very beginning again, and this is the end of my images. I put the tunnel opens a little bit beyond the timeline because I estimated there would be about 6 inches of asphalt on top of the boring sample. So that's the conclusion of the timeline, or the beginning, depending on how you look at it, and the end of this. Thank you. A little piece of this. I think this is boring lava, although quite frankly, I can't remember. But it is weathered. That is a distinct marking. Thank you.
So Demian Yazhi documents the landscape of the U.S. through an indigenous queer lens. In The Shift of Ground to Land, he introduces the implications of power when a material moves into an idea, living into ownership. Please welcome Demian.
Hello, my name is Demian Yazhi. I'm a transdisciplinary artist. I'm originally from New Mexico, the Dine tribe, so like the desert. My clans are Nastoje, Tabaha, and Torechini. Before starting, I'd like to take a moment to honor and recognize that we are currently guests residing on the stolen and occupied lands of the indigenous Multnomah tribes. I say this to honor the labor, spirituality, and resilience of indigenous peoples in maintaining and caretaking of the land, water, and surrounding environment since time immemorial. In this tradition, I'd also like to take this moment to personally thank all the hard work and labor involved in putting an event like this together, but also the programs, facilities, and janitorial staff at the Oregon Convention Center. I'd also like to thank Namita Wiggers for her generosity in including my voice alongside two inspiring artists such as Bill Will and Sara Siestreem. And also just take this moment to show my honor and gratitude for Nicole, Nathan, and Namita Wiggers, who worked tirelessly to create the wonderful programming of the Museum of Contemporary Craft, which, thanks. Which was a celebrated institution, and now is, a permanent part of our Portland history. When Namita initially invited me to speak, I felt a little apprehensive because my ancestral people and land is not in this region. I'm from the Southwest. I'm from those canyons and deserts and mountains. But however, for the past 10 and a half years, I've called this place home. And this is actually where I'm from. This is a traditional hogan on my mother's side, which resides in the in the Chinle Valley outside of Canyon de Chelly in Arizona. However, for the past 10 and a half years, I've called this place home. My ancestors, prior to colonization, were a migratory people. It is written into our creation stories, and these creation stories existed on this continent long before the introduction of violent concepts inherent in contemporary Western religion. As an artist and poet, my primary focus is centered on the topics of decolonization, sovereignty, survivance, and migration. I want to take a moment to kind of speak. Oh, there's a slide missing here. No, it's totally fine. I had this piece at the Portland Art Museum. It was a part of this exhibition in the Center for Contemporary Native Arts, which was spearheaded by Dina Dart during her time at the Portland Art Museum. This piece, it was basically two samples taken from the Navajo reservation. One was a sample of coal, and the other one was a sample of dirt from pretty much just like 50 yards away from this hogan. And I included that piece in the exhibition, and for purposes of speaking today, to speak about like the ceremony and the ceremony and spirituality of land for the Navajo people. This land has had so much ceremonial practices done. Like mostly all my sisters have had their like kinalda ceremony. Like it's just celebrating like a young girl into like femalehood essentially. And with that, like you dig a mound, you just dig into the earth this like giant cake made out of corn, and that kind of like just gets shared among the community. But it's a 4-day like ceremonial process. And so in removing this land, bringing it up here to Portland and transporting it back, I was having this conversation about like the migratory experience of indigenous culture, of indigenous peoples. But I also wanted to enter into this conversation about like the construct of like the prison industrial complex and how that has ties to indigenous reservations. That piece, both those pieces were titled, the titles for those pieces were taken directly from the Navajo Code Talker Dictionary. One of those pieces translates to native land, and the other one translates to land wound without self-defense. The coal originated from the Peabody coal mine, which is a coal facility on it's a coal company located on the Navajo reservation. And it is estimated that 7.8 million tons of coal have been extracted each year. So with that, I apologize for not having the image. Oh, you're totally good. But I wanted to sort of just take this moment to read a poem to both introduce you to the space, but also take you through a walk through my own ancestry. This piece is also about honoring the resilience of matrilineal and matriarchal societies. I grew up in a household of like primarily 5 older women. Like my father was actively around, but I feel like a lot of those traditions and social customs that I was introduced to was always through this female lens. So in speaking about like queerness and gender constructs or gender gradiency, I also have to bear in mind that like my own like introduction or comfortability with like navigating masculine spaces is always sort of influenced by this feminine energy or feminine presence. So this piece is called Antelope on the Canyon Walls. I grew up in a household with 5 older women and my father, and being the only boy, I always had a room of my own. When I was 4, we moved away from the reservation. Sometimes I think my first memory must have been riding in my father's truck as we drove away from my grandparents' house, a trailer resting beside a hogan, planted firmly to the floor of an ocean in the Chinle Valley, flowing out like water from a windmill. Mostly, I imagine my first memory must have emerged in the embryo, as my parents listened to Stevie Nicks and Jackson Browne as they drove to the Indian capital of the world, with my sisters seated in the back seat, and as we crossed the threshold of W.P.A and enter the United States of America, I remember all my ancestors that traversed this land from first light to eventide, or from the first encounter with the Bilagana to the relatives we parted ways with in northern Canada, or maybe it was during a prayer in my grandmother's hogan, at the moment when everyone was talking together and joking around in a dated version of Navajo that slowly disappears with the passing of our elders. And in my dreaming through that mist of tribal memory, I run my fingers along the interior of my mother's womb, like my ancestors drawing antelope on the canyon walls. And in that wet, embryonic state, I remember the suspicious and seductive introduction of the English language, and then another memory strikes me behind my head, across my ass, against the back of my head, knocks my field of vision into an abstract clutter of treachery, and I hear gunfire and screaming and church songs and a stampede of horses running from a cornfield ablaze, and I notice bloody sheep wool from murdered sheep we won't eat. And in my dreaming through that labyrinth of ancestral memory, I remember the sun and the formation of the stars and asteroids and constellations before my gender became a compass, before my gender became a scar or a performance or a privilege or clouded in mystery or Catholic shame. I remember floating in a sea of long black hair, weightless above the cradle of civilization, before my sexuality became oppressive or life-threatening, before it became a slur or a joke or a jail cell or a virus, or a wound against my head as blood drained into cracks of dry earth in some earthen canyon while I was running for my life, running against the wind, running up that hill, running on empty, while I ran so far away 'cause baby, we were born to run, baby, run, run to the hills, run for your lives. And somewhere in my DNA is a Zuni woman, a Nakai man, a Bilagana man, and a Danak woman, and they've all survived to write these words, and they're all memorized by creation stories, and they've all been held prisoner by a corrupt empire, and they're all worried about disease, so they make us wash our hands, only to wash their hands after they touch our skin. And my entire life has been one epidemic to the next, from smallpox to influenza to diabetes to malignant tumors to the hantavirus to HIV and AIDS to genocide to capitalism and the next wave of environmental meltdown. The first memory is always a collective memory tied to ancestral memory. Maybe it's the memory of breathing, or the memory of learning to crawl and walk. Maybe it's the memory of laughing for the first time, or emerging from the womb of my mother and into the glittering world. Thank you.
So I have to apologize for missing that slide. I'm so sorry. So moving from Demian, we're going to go through a large amount of time in a very short period, which is not unlike what you just shared with us, but a little bit different. So moving seamlessly between the past and the present is possible, when the history of 10,000 years is visibly available. In other words, the clay objects that you see impact what you in turn make, understand, and value. In 2014, I had the opportunity to visit Bornholm, a Danish island that sits in the Baltic Sea off the southern coast of Sweden. These nesting bowls are made from clay on the island, which houses the only school in Denmark focused on ceramics today. The access to history reveals a continuity of forms and practices connected to the land and to the kind of clay on an island that works well to shape and form in this way. Resources like this are available in places like the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where ceramic and woven vessels and baskets by the indigenous peoples of this continent, of this land, are also on view. Because our country is huge and our museums are scattered too, objects such as these reside in a range of types of institutions, if at all. More often than not, our indigenous histories are conveyed through fragments and shards, bits and pieces that reveal puzzles, like these fragments uncovered in 2014 by Scott Thomas, archaeologist for the U.S. Bureau of Land Management in sand dunes in southern Oregon. Ceramics are rare to find in this area, but these particular fragments at the site have the hallmarks of Shoshone work from the late 1400s to 1800s. More importantly, perhaps, is that the site contains shards from multiple historic time periods, a reminder that the ground contains histories, and it is revealing how we engage those histories in whatever way we choose to sort through them when we bring them to the surface. Sara Siestreem reminds us that it is important to bring such ways of working back into view. And when we invited Sara, she was waiting to hear back about a residency, and fortunately for Sara, she got the residency. Unfortunately for us, she couldn't be here today. So she is being represented in a film that Nicole Nathan and I commissioned for the State of Oregon Craft, which is an exhibition that we did in 2015. And in this video, Sara and Frank Boyden remind us of the connections between materials and nature, art and ecology, and the importance of connecting the past and the present to rethink histories. And just so you know, in case you don't know, Frank Boyden is the founder of the Sitka Center for Art and Ecology on the coast of Oregon. Whoops, oh, sorry.
We built the first building at Sitka in 1972. Although we didn't really know it at the time, it was really almost the first time that this had been done. Sitka Center for Art and Ecology became something that people began to come in from all over just to see what we were doing. The idea had been from the start that we would put together a place where young artists just coming out of school could come together and they'd work together collaboratively, and then they would put together a program for young adults or other artists, and they would then leave and another group would come in and they would do the same thing. There's not very many places in this world anymore where you can be a cell in a structure that really makes a difference.
The Sitka Art Center has a tremendous reputation in the arts community as a serene and beautiful location. The environment where I dug the root here today is different than where I generally will gather the root. But that was really exciting to me too, to see what happens when you're in a higher elevation and the tree is kind of different. In nature, things are, when things are in balance, they're at their strongest, and so it's the same with the basket. So I'm Hannes Koos, and we're from the south coast of Oregon. A lot of our life perspectives have to do with metaphors based on the salmon cycle. It has to do with everyday life, what we eat and how we live and all that kind of stuff, but it also has to do with the spiritual idea about how to live your life properly. Weaving became this way where I could go play in the woods, but I could do it for a reason that wasn't just to make my heart happy, but I could be of service.
A large percentage of the people who come to Sitka as residents from other places, young people that end up staying in Oregon. stay and work in Oregon. And as far as I'm concerned, the more people like that in Oregon, the better off we are.
Moving from the rural to the urban, this is a photo of the first brick building erected in Portland at the corner of the intersection of Southwest Front Avenue and Southwest Alder Street. Built by Joseph T. Young, a mason from Waterloo, Illinois, family tradition documents its construction in 1853. This photo was taken in February of 1941, a few months before it was raised to widen Front Avenue and create Southwest Harbor Drive. And for those of you who are from Portland or those of you who are visiting us, you will notice there is a tremendous amount of construction going on all over our city, so some things don't change. The history of brickmaking in Portland, however, as it connects to clay and ceramic history, is another story that is yet to be told, and one we will return to shortly. Bricks were not the only uses for the mineral-rich clay in Portland. Established in 1873, Pacific Pottery changed hands a few times before 1909, 1910, depending on what the source is, when T.S. Mann brought out his partners and renamed it the Pacific Stoneware Company. The plant was located for many years at 695 Sherlock Avenue, and later a newer plant constructed in 1928 at 1945 Peninsula Avenue on 2 acres of land. The history of the Columbia River Valley from the Dalles to the sea, written in 1928, explains that the principal products are stone jars and flower pots. Noteworthy fact that the half dozen or more concerns that have started in this line of business in the state, Pacific is the only one still in business. And these jars still surface from time to time on eBay. This is working clay that can be made into durable and hefty stoneware dishes and can be pushed and molded into dinnerware service, as you see in this ad from 1951, and the vase pulled from eBay from roughly the same time period. Throughout the 1960s, potters were paid by the piece to throw for Bennett Welsh, who ran the company while also maintaining a studio and teaching at the museum school, now Pacific Northwest College of Art. David Frank describes working for Bennett meant throwing piece after piece and being paid 10 cents a bowl. These were then glazed by someone else, who David notes determined what the finished products would look like. In fact, he's not real happy that there's some things out there that are all kinds of colors, pinks with oranges and turquoises and so forth. But these objects that came out of this process could range from anything like this pouring vessel by Bill Kreitz to the Snooty Hooty Owl cookie jar and Handlebar Mustache Man Face ceramic mug from 1968 and 1971. And I have to tell you that I've met several potters who have told me that they wish they'd saved even just a small bit of what they made for while they were working for Bennett Welsh, instead of pretty much smoking away all their earnings. They said that life was really good. They would throw pots in the morning and smoke pot all afternoon. This is the factory today and a map to give you a sense of where it sits in terms of the city. So through the talk, there are a couple of places where I will have maps. And what I've done is I've organized the maps where the point of origin is the convention center. So it's where you are right now, and then gives you a sense of the different directions around the city. So even in 1947, the brick and tile industries in Oregon were a part of the local economies. And you can see here where the clay deposits are located and production was still taking place. I don't know how many of these are still in production. That, again, is another one of the stories that remains to be documented going forward. But it was the company Tektronix, a high-tech firm founded by Howard Vollum and a number of others in 1945 that connected industry and clay in different ways. Material and equipment was still scarce following the war, but after years of development work on cathode ray oscilloscopes, among other things, Vollum established an electronics firm on Southeast 7th and Hawthorne. In 1947, there were 12 employees. By 1952, 359 and multiple offices, and the company moved again in 1951. During the early 1950s, atomic and hydrogen bomb tests were being conducted in the South Pacific, and the main measuring instruments for these tests were produced by Tektronix, number 517s and 513s. Dozens of scopes recorded events lasting only a fraction of a second. Many were destroyed after serving their purposes or returned to Beaverton to be cleaned after contamination with radioactive fallout. Howard and his wife, Jean Vollum, have been important supporters of craft in Portland, particularly at Oregon College of Art and Craft, and a number of the employees at Tektronix worked in ceramics outside of industrial applications. This includes George Wright, about whom Janice Buskirk wrote an article in March of 1998 in Ceramics Monthly. Born in 1917, George passed away in 2012, and he's remembered for his innovative kiln designs and support for Northwest potters. He was involved in clay, but he wasn't a particularly good potter, and he owned a brick factory in Molalla since the end of World War II. The potter in the family was his wife, Pearl. It was her working with clay purchased from LA that led George to figure out how to transform the brickyard clay into pottery clay. And this led to a clay business that soon supplied schools and potters across the state. In the mid-60s, he began working for Tektronix in the ceramics department, which he has described as the easiest job, turning switches on and off kilns all day. David Frank shared with me that at that time there was a 150-foot kiln. Wet clay went in and out on the other end after George pushed all the right switches. It came out cool to touch and ready to use. After he left Tektronix, he and Pearl bought 30 acres in Manning, where many young potters still living and working in Portland today learned to experiment with kilns, including making this Korean-based one. In the 1980s, George developed a clay for making large sculptures that contained nylon wire called Hair of the Dog. Has anyone here in the room used Hair of the Dog? Yes, awesome, I was hoping so. And it's called that because it has a hairy texture when you cut it with the wire. George's massive pug mill, the one that he used was from the late 1800s, and he modified it with different new things like using a pickup truck to run it when it wasn't working. He was amazing with fixing things, and so this was one of the things that he kept fixing again and again. If and when you go to Georgie's, and I hope all of you will make a stop up there, Georgie's is the main place where potters in Portland buy their clay, and that pug mill is right outside, slowly sinking into the ground. We've had a lot of extra rain this last month, and it's sinking probably a little more than it has in the past. Georgie's was established in 1965 by George Tonneson as a decorative plasterware business, and the company was a vehicle to put the family's 3 kids through college, which it did, and then pulled them back into the business. Plastercraft declined in popularity, and in 1980, the company entered the ceramics business, adding making pottery in 1986, and acquired Oregon Clay, one of the older businesses still in operation in the state, to its holdings. For decades, Georgie's has supported the community by getting the clay people want and need, as well as donating tons, literally tons of clay for the Oregon Potters Association's Empty Bowls collaboration with Oregon food banks, to schools, and for decades it supported the residents at the Contemporary Crafts Gallery as well. It was challenging to maintain tile and brick businesses in Portland, particularly after the Great Depression, when many of the American art tile factories closed. Art tile was considered utilitarian, and production moved to other parts of the world. And interest in clay and working with clay shifted to other forms, from tableware to sculpture. In 1982, Michael Pratt and Rita Larson opened Pratt & Larson Ceramics, leading a revival in art tile influenced by their trips to Moravian and Mexican potteries. Located at 1201 3rd Avenue, you can arrange for factory tours. And I just want to make a public thank you to Pratt & Larson for supplying the tile that was in the Museum of Contemporary Crafts bathrooms. I can say that we had the prettiest bathrooms in any public art building in Portland at one time. But there's another connection that would surprise you. William Gruber partnered in 1939 with Harold Graves, president of Sawyer's, a company specializing in souvenir picture postcards, to create one of the most popular toys in U.S. history, the Viewmaster, made right here in Portland. Debuted at the 1939 World's Fair in New York, more than 100,000 were sold by 1941, and before the mid-1940s, the company used 3D tabletop models made out of clay to create narratives, later winning the license to all Walt Disney characters from competitors TrueView in 1951. And these are terrible slides, but the internet is a beautiful thing, and somebody took the time to take photographs of these clay models that were used pre-Disney to tell the story of Cinderella. Even the Museum of Contemporary Craft, when it was Oregon Ceramic Studio, made a viewmaster of the 4th Ceramic Annual, in which Peter Volkus, among others, participated. And no, that image is not from the annual, but I couldn't find an image where we'd shot through the annual. But of course, we can't forget Oregon's own Will Vinton, who coined the term claymation to describe his own work with tabletop clay models, famously used in the 1970s and 1980s California raisin ads. Vinton began experimenting with his father's old 16mm equipment and developed stop-motion techniques that were time-absorbing and painstaking, working methods, he notes, may never be done in the same way again. And of course, today's newest industrial clay model comes in the form of Mud Shark, which I hope all of you will get the chance to visit while you're here. The 20th century signaled important shifts in clay away from industry into art, and Portland is no different. This cover of West Shore magazine, headquartered in Portland from 1875 to 1891, depicts Chinese laborers working in what was then East Portland or Albina, making bricks from clay and sand. By 1890, brickmaking had become an important business in the area, and in 1889, 8 million bricks were shipped to Seattle alone. Inexpensive immigrant labor and the introduction of new machinery, like the brick presses seen here, made this scale of production possible. Now, W.P.A, who was born in Portland in 1893, however, did not work in the brick factories. W lived and worked in Portland's Chinatown, and you can see the distance between where we are now to where he lived in that area. W was nearly deaf due to a firecracker accident when he was a small boy, and his talent for drawing and painting was recognized early. W.P. attended the museum school, now PNCA, and in 1929 received the first Carey Prize. PNCA was founded as part of the Portland Art Museum, originally the Museum Art School, and in 1981, it became an independent college and moved to Portland's Pearl District in 1998. In 2008, PNCA purchased the 511 Federal Building, which some of you visited yesterday or will visit during the course of the conference to see some exhibitions. Moved into that building in 2015. In 2009, it entered a partnership with Museum of Contemporary Craft, and in 2016, closed the museum, sold the building, and absorbed its collection and archives into the college. W.P. found work during the Depression through the federal arts projects, including Timberline Lodge and Mount Hood, which brought hundreds to the area for work. Key produced ceramic centerpieces for the lodge and for Tongue Point Naval Station. The Timberline project was massive and had a major impact on the region through tourism as well as through this influx of artisans. The project required an on-site iron forge to fabricate all of the pieces, and if you look closely, you'll recognize the Sawyer Company signature on that souvenir postcard. For those of you who have not yet visited the lodge, here's just one example of the type of work that you can see there. W.P. was working through mold making, and there are some molds in the museum's collection. Mold making was primarily the way of working at that time. And through the New Deal art projects, works such as this vessel were preserved and are in the collection of the Portland Art Museum. We were putting birds on things long before Portlandia. Just saying. W.P. was also a photographer and painter and is perhaps best known for this work. And his street scenes were invaluable as cultural records, but he also painted landscapes as well. And W.P. was really instrumental in getting the Oregon Ceramic Studio up and running and working closely with Lydia Herrick Hodge and Vakian Ross, who taught at the University of Oregon and had been a student of Glenn Lucan's. Together, they developed molds and glazes for ceramic tableware, rumored to be used extensively in Portland's Chinatown restaurants, although we haven't been able to verify if that's true or not. Key also sculpted models for the U.S. Defense Program's Camouflage Research. A salmon sculpture similar to this is at Timberline Lodge. In 1937, Oregon Ceramic Studio opened in Portland, Oregon, with its first exhibition featuring the work of California potters Laura Andreessen, Helen Gardner, Glenn Lucan's, Gertrude and Otto Knotzler, and Beatrice Wood. Clay was central, And in fact, at one time, the Oregon Ceramic Studio boasted the largest kiln west of the Mississippi. In exchange for receiving the land at Oregon Ceramic Studio, they paid $10 to the Portland Public Schools and fired all of the work from one single grade of school children during the year. So the artists in residence like Hal Rieger and Ken Shores spent considerable amount of time learning how to work with clay by repairing small horse heads or legs or different things as they were fixing the sculptures and then glazing them to move them forward. In 1965, the population was pretty big given the baby boom after World War II, and Oregon Ceramic Studio shifted from doing this work for the Portland Public Schools and actually changed its name to Contemporary Crafts Gallery. In 2002, it became Contemporary Crafts Museum and Gallery, and in 2007, it moved downtown as Museum of Contemporary Craft. And some of you will be confused if you do research. Museum of Contemporary Crafts, with an S, is the one that was Museum of Arts and Design now. We dropped the S because we wanted to treat craft as a category, a subject, potential for it to be a verb or a noun, and not necessarily linked just to a specific studio craft movement, but to think about craft in a much broader and bigger way. To have a museum dedicated to craft became the newest incarnation of a beloved local arts organization, as well as the newest addition to the visual arts ecology here in Portland. And I thought I'd share with you a couple of the projects that we did, just a few of them. This is an exhibition we did on Eric Gronberg. And what's exciting about this exhibition is it gave the chance to tell us a historic story in Portland of Eric's connection here, but also to connect him with collectors like Ron Werner, who has collected his pieces, and many of the pieces in this exhibition came from that. Also to connect him with young emerging curators who, like Garth Johnson, and to connect him with contemporary artists like Jeffrey Mitchell. So one of the things we tried to do was to pull stories out, but to contextualize them in a contemporary moment and reframe them in a way that connected to them with what's happening now. We also looked back on history, and there was a collector in town who owned more than 50 Gertrude and Otto Knotzler bowls. And it was an incredible privilege to be able to go over to their house and have chicken salad and play with their dachshund, and then spend time looking and touching all of these bowls. Because yes, when you're in their homes, you get to touch everything, and it's pretty fantastic. They were instrumental in helping us put together exhibitions and the collection at the museum over the years. And in addition to that, we were doing exhibitions that went back and looked at the museum's own history. So documenting history, taking time to put that history forward, to commission essays, to photograph, document, that's the scholarship that museums offer. That's what moves beyond just the maneuvers of history making to actually making and constructing history itself. We also did exhibitions that reframed studio pottery as part of larger art movements. So if you think about David Shaner, who is known as a potter's potter and worked very much on a human scale, if you think about him as somebody who is part of a land art zeitgeist, people who are interested in the land in a different way, it shifts the focus from men with machines scarring the earth, digging in the earth, to actually thinking about the fact that the relationship between clay and the land might have had origins in a different place. Specifically, I would argue through ceramics, because David Shaner was doing his work in 1964. Smithson and all of those guys didn't get out to the West until a little later in the decade. And we also reframed art through ceramics with exhibitions like the Ai Weiwei exhibition that was organized by Arcadia University. We brought performance into the space through Gestures of Resistance, where Erin Toole, who's doing a piece up at Oregon College of Art and Craft right now, created a bunker and created bowls and distributed the cups to visitors while telling stories. And Theaster Gates gave the entire exhibition a good whitewashing, which was kind of a nightmare to clean up. We also did exhibitions like Generation Betty Fevis that took 8 years to put together. Exhibitions aren't slow, they're long. If you're doing history, it's long. History's a long thing. And I say that because I think it's really important to recognize that the loss of the Museum of Contemporary Craft means that that history is not visible in the same way that it has been for a number of years, for 79 years here in Portland, with a specific focus on craft and in ceramics in particular. Betty Fivas is a fantastic example of somebody who was deeply rooted to the land in two ways. One, she made her own clay. Partly that was out of necessity at the beginning, and then it became her aesthetic, and also because she was rooted to the land through community. She didn't have anybody around her who knew how to do the work she was doing. So she would call you, and she would call you, and she would call you, and she'd say, hey, let's go for a hike and see if we can find clay. Well, she knew exactly where she was going to take you because she had the Oregon Geological Survey and knew exactly where to go to take you to dig the clay. You came back feeling like you had discovered clay with Betty Fivas, and she would show you how to work the clay and create work, and then she had a community of potters in her own backyard. That's another way in which clay shapes the land and is shaped by the land as you go forward. We also did exhibitions like this, where Nicole Nathan looked back at the connection between historic exhibitions, like the exhibition that we did in the early 50s with Bernard Leach and British ceramics, and then showing British ceramics that are in private collections here in Portland. I got ahead of my notes here, hold on. So with Oregon College of Art and Craft was founded in, I believe, 1909, and I know that many of you will go up to this campus. This is one of the places in town where you can still go and deeply immerse yourself in ceramics and clay practice. There are other places that offer some ceramics work. There are ceramics studios at PNCA and at PSU. Portland State University is where Ray Grimm founded the program in 1957. And was also the person who brought the first glass shack, the first studio glass program. And there's this huge connection, as you all know, between ceramics and glass and the use of studios and bringing it into studio practice. Ray actually brought that to Portland. Ray and Jerry Grimm were at the 1957 conference that the American Craft Council did at Asilomar in California. And Ray was also at the famous workshop in the early 60s where Labino and Littleton introduced the idea of the studio glass movement in the United States. And he brought all of that knowledge back to Portland and shared it through this program where he trained countless art educators throughout the entire state. Here are just some of the educators who are working now, and this is a very, very, very small sampling, but it gives you a sense of the different colleges that are represented here. They're Lewis and Clark, Portland State University, Oregon College of Art and Craft, the community colleges. This is a place, as Hamza Walker once said to me, where you actually make things with clay, and that's not going away, and we're very, very lucky to have that here in Portland. Ash Street is the newest incarnation of an educational model. This was founded by Thomas Orr and Joanne Bloom, and I'm hoping that you all will make a point of going to visit Ash Street as well. They are interested in the idea of working one-on-one, close, intimate relationships between apprentice and teacher, and it's a place where you can learn how to work. You can apply for a residency and become an apprentice there. It also has an exhibition space as well. And last but not least, I want to end with Oregon Potters Association, which is actually going to be taking place right here in this convention center in April in 2017. And it is one of the largest, if not the largest, artist-run, organized, and organized ceramic showcases in the entire country. And potters come from all over the state to bring their work and share what they are working on. The Oregon Potters Association really began in 1980 as a way to compare clay bodies, and it's evolved into this ceramic showcase. And I wanted to end with this because I think it's really important, and what I've tried to do in this presentation today is not to just give you the studio craft version or the craft is art version of ceramics history in Portland, but to show you that clay is bigger than that. Clay is everywhere in Portland in lots of different forms and incarnations. And the power of the story of clay will be when we can find a way to bring studio ceramics, capital A art, folk art, indigenous traditions, factory production, and all of these kinds of things together where it doesn't matter where you have to distinguish between potter and ceramist, or I make functional work versus sculpture, but where it's all about clay. And that would be what I would go forward with as a vision that I hope someday Portland will reach that point. And I think given everyone that's here, we have the potential to do that. So thank you very much. So I looked at the time. We have 5 minutes if there's anyone who has questions. But and there's a microphone there if anybody would like to ask anything of Bill or Demian or myself.
Hi. I have, actually, it goes all the way back to the beginning, Bill. Every year for the last 5 years, I've been bringing my second graders on tour down into the West Side Light Rail. And I get the same question every year, and I'm so glad to have you here to ask you the question that I can't answer. The question I got it was just about 2 months ago I did this, and the question was, how long did it take all these artists to do this, and how did they do it, and did they work as a team, or did they work solo? And so if you could answer those questions, I could bring it back to my class. They'd be so happy.
It was a design team. So it was
Okay.
myself and 3 other artists and the architects and the engineers. But I was the lead on this project, so I sort of designed it. I envisioned it and designed it and followed through with it. That including hiring of subcontractors to do research, geologists to correlate the samples with the actual time, which they modified during the project, actually. So it was an ongoing thing. I was the sort of the person that led that, but there were, I would estimate 100 people who worked on the project, as far away as Spain, where the granite was quarried and shipped to the United States.
So all those images along the wall above the timeline are your ideas, your images?
Well, they're not my ideas, but I chose them just from my interests. And I chose them from just looking through old encyclopedias, and I learned about the Dawn redwood, which you saw the image of the tree, the living fossil. So I commissioned someone to draw that. Then they had to be turned into stencils so that they could be sandblasted, which was also a very complicated and time-consuming process, and then modified so it would actually work.
Thanks. And thank you, Namita and Demian, for sharing your stories.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody.